Hi, welcome to today's webinar. My name's Eleanor and I'll be looking after you today. So our first point of order is making sure you've noted the tabs where you can download attachments such as the slides from today. Live viewers can also ask questions and take part in the polls here. You might just need to come out of full screen mode to find them. And we love to reflect on your thoughts and questions, so I wanted to start today by asking you to think about the best team you've ever worked in. What was so great about that team? Drop a few words in the questions box to let me know, and you can also use that box if you have any thoughts or questions throughout. And if we can't fit them in, we can always come back to you after the session. This webinar will be recorded and available on our website to watch again or share later. So for those of you who don't know who we are and what we do, I think this picture tells a really nice story, and it's a story of personality differences with a few characters you might even recognise. There's the impulsive one who threw the confetti, the guy at the back who's wondering who's going to clean it all up, the lady who seems to be making a lot of noise about it, and the guy who's quietly reflecting on the beauty of the moment. So think how differently this team must approach projects together. I imagine there's going to be some conflict or resentment between the impulsive one and the guy who thinks about the consequences. And does the lady who vocalizes how she feels worry that the quiet reflector isn't having fun? And what we'd do is we'd give this team some frameworks to understand themselves and appreciate the strengths and blind spots each character has, and it would help them to anticipate and manage reactions to not only reduce conflict but achieve their goals in a united way. And more than that, we're going to be talking today about what this team looks like as part of the bigger picture. Does how they work together align to what the organisation and even the end customer needs from them? And do their leaders have the skills to guide them there? We'll focus mostly on the MBTI, but there are lots of options you might use that you can see here. And our presenter today, John Hackston, has that uncanny ability to package up years of dedicated study into short and easy to understand content. And you might recognise his name as he's often quoted in the press and articles and speaks at a number of events. And John, I definitely see you as the confetti thrower in that scenario. And I even think that looks a little bit like our office with those steel beams, don't you?
Thanks, Elder. I'm very curious as to why you see me as the confetti thrower. I hadn't necessarily saw myself as an impulsive person, though perhaps we can have a conversation about that a little bit later. But I agree that that picture did look a little bit like our office. But of course, I'm presenting this session today from my spare room at home. And many of us, probably most of us, if not all of us, are part of virtual teams now. And today's webcast is all about teams. But before we get on to that main question of why do some teams clash while others collaborate, let's look at the way in which you all are involved in teams. And we set up a little poll for you to answer, and then we've answered that. And it looks indeed as if, looking at those results, the majority of you are part of a team. 50% of you say you're not part of a team, another 50% one team, but majority, 69%, over two-thirds, are actually part of more than one team. And that just reflects the fact that for most of us, most of the time, we're probably in a number of different overlapping teams doing different things. And I know, Elder, that you asked people to reflect on the best team and what made a good team. What sort of comments or statements have we had from the audience already about what really made for them a team work?
I quite like this reflection actually, and it says it's hard to say if my best team is the one with my favourite people or the one who achieves the most. Is it about what keeps you in a job you enjoy or purely achieving goals?
Okay, and it does reflect, I think, that a team is defined, as you saw in our poll, as a group of people who work together to achieve a common goal, but there's a lot more going on in a team, a lot more dynamics, a lot more additional things happening in a team as well. Now, here's another question for you to perhaps think about, and not something I'm going to ask a poll about. But have you ever thought, ever in an idle moment wondered, if life would be so much easier, so much simpler, just less hard work perhaps, if everyone in the team was just a little bit more like you, perhaps? And it's certainly something that's gone through my mind from time to time, perhaps not on one of my best days. Of course, in practice, a team like this might just possibly have a few drawbacks. This group of people that you can see on the screen, well, despite the undoubted brilliance of each individual person in the team, this team may not actually perform so well working together as a team. And it would most definitely not be an ideal team, even if occasionally in an off moment I wonder if it might be, because each of us has our particular strengths, but each of us also has our weaknesses, our blind spots. And if everyone in the team was the same, those black holes in our awareness would just get more and more obvious and cause more and more problems. So in theory, you might expect more diverse teams to perform better than less diverse, more homogeneous teams. In a more diverse team, the people in that team can compensate for each other's weak spots and really make the most of everyone's strengths. That's the theory at any rate, but what about in practice? Well, the research evidence does suggest that in most situations, more diverse teams do indeed perform better. Here's where diverse teams tend to perform better than less diverse, more homogeneous teams. Diverse teams are likely to be better in situations, where new processes are needed, where there's an element of creativity, where people need to explore new things, where perhaps the tasks that people need to do are less straightforward, a little bit more complex, where there's an element of uncertainty and ambiguity around the place, and perhaps when things aren't in a steady state, where things are changing. There are, however, some situations where less diverse, more homogeneous teams perform better. And those tend to be things like where really things are already known, where the team just has to implement set processes, things already known, things which are already established, where the tasks that people need to do are quite straightforward and only require quite simple responses, where there isn't a great deal of uncertainty and ambiguity around the place, where things are staying the same. Now, a question I would ask you is, which is your team environment? Are things for you and your teams much more like things at the left-hand side of that slide, or much more like things at the right-hand side of this slide? And I'm not going to take a poll on this, but I'd be very surprised if it wasn't the case that for most of you, the situation is much more at the left-hand side. In the current moment of everything that's going on, the way things are changing due to things like the COVID-19 virus, things are in a state of flux. But for most people, things were changing, and there's a degree of ambiguity and uncertainty around the workplace, and things were more complex even before the COVID pandemic came along. So most of the situations that we face today, diverse teams will perform better than less diverse teams. But that doesn't, I'm very sorry to say, mean that everything then is going to be plain sailing. So for example, diverse teams tend to take longer to make decisions, and in a more homogeneous team, everybody tends to think in very similar ways. There's little disagreement, so decisions tend to be very quick. But those decisions in a homogeneous team can also be very one-sided and subject to groupthink. Whereas in a more diverse team, there's going to be different viewpoints, different ideas, different opinions, and all of these need to be gone through and surfaced if members of that team are going to feel shortchanged or disadvantaged. But the final result, the final decision, has a much better chance of being a more well-rounded and an altogether better decision in the long run. But because of all these different views and approaches, this can lead to a degree of conflict. Some diverse teams will clash, while others do seem to be able to cooperate more fully. So it's really important that people can understand where other members of the team are coming from, how to communicate with them, and how to either avoid conflict or use that conflict in a more productive way. And the key to understanding that is understanding something about personality. Because research shows that the mix of personalities in a team does have an effect on the team's performance. And two aspects of personality are particularly important here: extroversion, introversion, and judging and deceiving. And some of you have probably noticed we've already opened a poll to ask you about your knowledge of the MBTI framework, because in a moment we're going to look in more detail at what extroversion, introversion, and judging and deceiving actually are. Generally, many teams with a mix of extroverts and introverts do tend to perform better, whereas teams with a mix of judging and deceiving personality types actually tend to perform less well overall. So let's look at what we mean by extroversion, introversion, and by judging and deceiving, and let's look at what the implications of that are and what we can do with it. And as we said, these aspects of personality all form part of the MBTI framework, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator framework. But before I start going through the MBTI framework in detail, let's just look at your answers to the poll. So quite a few of you are MBTI qualified, about 60% of you, I think. But some of you have received feedback but not been trained to use it. Some of you have heard of the MBTI but not actually completely used it. So I'm going to beg the indulgence for a short while of those of you who are MBTI practitioners and use it often, and just spend a short while to go through what the MBTI framework covers, what the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is all about. And at its base, the MBTI framework looks at four aspects of human personality. It looks first of all at extroversion and introversion. This is all about where you get your energy from and where you focus your attention. People with a preference for extroversion focus their attention on the outside world of people and things, and that's where they get their energy from. Whereas people with preference for introversion tend to focus their attention on the inner world of thoughts and feelings, and that's where they get their energy from. And you notice I'm talking about preferences. People with a preference for extroversion are people with a preference for introversion. And we can all do extroversion, we can all do introversion, we can all use both of these at different times, but the idea and the theory behind the MBTI is that underneath it all, we have a preference for one way or the other, a preference for extroversion or a preference for introversion. The MBTI isn't about skill or ability, it's about your personality preferences. The second area is sensing and intuition, which is all about the sort of information that you prefer. People with a preference for sensing prefer to use and rely on information which is real, which is actual, which is solid, which is practical, which comes from the evidence of their five senses or their clear memory of the evidence of their five senses. And that's where the word sensing comes from. Whereas people with a preference for intuition prefer to rely on how things connect together, the possibilities, where things are going rather than what past experience tells us. Thinking and feeling is all about the process you prefer to use to make decisions. People with a preference for thinking prefer to make decisions where they can on the basis of objective logic, whereas people with a preference for feeling prefer where they can to make decisions on the basis of values and how their values are affected and on how those decisions will affect people. And last but not least, judging and deceiving looks at your lifestyle, how you deal with the world around you. People with a preference for judging prefer to live their lives in a more structured, organized, planned way, whereas people with a preference for perceiving prefer where they can to live their lives in a more open, spontaneous, unplanned way. So we have these four areas: extroversion or introversion, sensory intuition, thinking, feeling, judging, and perceiving. In each case, an individual will have a preference for one side or the other: extroversion or introversion, sensing or intuition, thinking or feeling, judging and perceiving. And if you add up the combinations of that, that means there are 16 possible different personality types. So, for example, someone might have preferences for introversion, for sensing, for thinking, or for judging, and we say that their overall type was ISTJ. Now, on the previous slide, we talked about the idea that teams with a mix of extroversion and introversion tend to perform well, but teams with a mix of judging and receiving tend to perform less well. Let's see why this might be the case. First of all, let's look at extroversion and introversion. So to introverts, extroverts can seem loud, can seem brash, can even seem overbearing. In a meeting, extroverts sometimes can seem to be vying for attention with each other. They're often happy to talk over each other, and maybe everybody's talking at once, and this isn't, as far as they're concerned, about rude or about cutting people off. It's just that if things come into your head, you say those things out loud because talking things through is just what you do. It's just the way you live your life. So to introverts, a lot of what extroverts say may sometimes seem somewhat inconsequential, not thought through. While introverts can have difficulty in a meeting, sometimes getting a word in edgeways. And to extroverts, introverts may seem disengaged. They may see introverts as too quiet. Why don't they just say what they think when it comes up? Introverts don't always respond quickly to questions because they're thinking things through so they can give the best answer. But as far as an extrovert is concerned, perhaps they think the introvert isn't interested. Or maybe that person isn't answering quickly because they're just not that clever. But of course, all of these are misconceptions. And actually, introverts and extroverts can work together really well once they know where the other person is coming from. Introverts can make use of and appreciate the energy and the orientation to do things and take action that extroverts can bring. Extroverts can learn that when introverts say something, it's usually the end point of a long train of thought, so that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that's going to be a really worthwhile contribution and certainly shouldn't be ignored until people have had a chance to listen to it and evaluate it. And sometimes the right thing to do in a situation is to pause before rushing into a decision. Last month we presented a webinar that goes into a lot more detail about extroversion and especially introversion, and we cover this ground about extroversion in a little bit more detail, and we'll send you a link to that webinar after this session. So whatever our natural preference for extroversion or for introversion, we can learn to work together with our opposite. And tools like the MBTI can really help with this by raising our self-awareness and giving us a framework for first understanding ourselves, then understanding how we and other people differ, and then using that understanding, using that information to understand other people better and work more effectively with other people. Now, when it comes to extroversion and introversion, we already know that diverse teams generally perform well. Though certainly understanding of personality type can help improve that, can help things further. And perhaps this shouldn't be so surprising. Whether we behave in an extroverted or an introverted way is one of the more obvious things about us and our personalities. It's something that most people, certainly not everybody, but most people are aware of to at least some extent. But when it comes to judging and perceiving, perhaps things are a little bit different. We know that teams that are more diverse in this aspect of personality usually perform less well. Let's think about why that might be. So as we've said, judging and perceiving is all about how we prefer to live our lives. Given the chance, would you rather live your life in a fairly ordered, structured way, where you've planned things in advance, you know what's coming up, you know what's going to happen? That's the judging approach. Or would you rather live in a more open, spontaneous way, where you can do things as and when things seem right, and you don't have to stick to plans or a rigid schedule? Now, both of these are equally valid ways to be. equally reasonable ways to live your life, but when judging and perceiving people have to work together in a team, things don't always go so well. So in a team, judging people can see perceiving people as disorganized. Because the perceiving person may not start a job as soon as the judging person would, or have a clear and obvious and overt plan, knowing that perhaps things will get done on time. And the judging person might try to set artificial deadlines or micromanage a person with a perceiving preference. And that tends not to work so well, tends not to go down so well. And it may be that the picture you can see on the slide at the moment is an example of that happening. Perceiving people can see judging people as inflexible, with rigid plans that mean they are unable to change tack when circumstances change, and circumstances will change. And as wanting to make decisions and move on before there's been really enough time to really appreciate the situation and come up with the best plan. But just like for extroversion and introversion, judging and perceiving people can work together very well. So those with a judging preference can help to make sure that things do get done on time. Those with a perceiving preference can bring flexibility when conditions change and stop things being shut down too soon. But knowledge of judging and perceiving is less well known than knowledge of extroversion and introversion. It's more likely to be seen as a deliberate choice, more likely to be seen as something that the other person is doing just to annoy you, or just because they don't care, just to pee you off. So knowing yourself, knowing how you fit into the team, understanding how the other people in the team can operate, that really is the key to turning a dysfunctional team into a more functioning, into a productive team, into an effective team. And tools like the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator assessment give you a way to gain that knowledge. In a research project a little while ago, we asked people the question, where was at work where building your self-awareness had been most helpful? And the respondents to the survey came up with all kinds of answers, things like coping with stress, dealing with change, working well with clients. But the most frequent answer they mentioned was working with others in a team. So there's good reasons for really understanding other people's personality to work in a team. But let's now look at the practicalities. Let's look at just how you might go about using the MBTI framework to help people, to help you, to help your team, to help your clients, to help people in general work better with others in a team. And all of the areas I'm going to talk through are available directly to managers and team leaders through the new Teams functionality in the MBTI online system, or to those of you, which I know was the majority of you in the group, to train MBTI practitioners through the MBTI team report. Now, we said earlier that the combination of extroversion and introversion, sensing, intuition, thinking and feeling, and judging and perceiving means that there are 16 possible types. Here they are laid out in the format that's usually called a type table. Now, any team is going to be made up from a selection of types from around this table. So, for example, this team might contain one person with preferences for ENTP: extroversion, intuition, thinking, and perceiving. Now, knowing someone's type won't tell you everything about a person's behavior, but it can tell you quite a lot. So, for example, these are the sorts of behaviors, the sort of strengths that someone with ENTP preferences can bring to a team. They're likely to be very quick to see new opportunities, to be tuned into new possibilities. When it comes to analyzing and solving problems, they'll try and approach those logically and objectively. They may bring an entrepreneurial spirit to the team, they'll focus on the big picture, and so on. I won't read all of those points, as you can see them on the screen. But the key thing in a team is but the extent to which we're able to do these things, the extent to which we're able to bring these strengths to bear, will depend on the context. And that very much will include the personality preferences of the other people in the team and of the team as a whole. So let's look at the rest of the team. In this example team, as well as our ENTP person, this particular team includes two people with preferences for ISTJ, one with ESTJ preferences, and one with preferences for ENTJ. So 5 people in all. And if we look at the types of the team overall, the number of people with E and I preferences, S and N, T and F, J and P, we can see, for example, that there are more people with an extroversion preference than with an introversion preference. 3 people with an extroverted preference, 2 people with preference introversion, so the team may have more of an extroversion flavor overall. More people with a sensing than an intuitive preference. No one at all with a feeling preference, so the team is, everyone has a thinking preference, the team will very definitely have a thinking feel to it, or thinking approach to it, and definitely more people with a judging preference. So overall, this is an ESTJ kind of team. And the words that you can see written in the blue border around the figure, assertive, decisive, realistic, logical, organized, and so on, these will tend to describe the overall character of this particular team. And that means that as a team, this team will potentially have a lot of strengths. It's likely to take decisions quite quickly and put those into action very quickly. Those decisions are likely to be based on things which are very clearly known or known facts. They're going to set very clear goals and clear expectations for those goals and have plans and organize so they meet those goals in a scheduled way. Those goals are going to be likely to be focused on practical results, and they're going to drive others to achieve objectives both within the team and people outside the team as well. And when it comes to solving problems, they're going to typically approach those logically and objectively. But as a team, they may also have some blind spots. So, for example, the flip side of making quick decisions and taking action quickly is that they may make snap decisions and then have to redo work later. So especially when it comes to important decisions, it's really useful for this team to sit down and make sure that they've actually spent time discussing all the facts, all the possibilities and implications of that decision before we move on. And in a short while, we'll look at some techniques that this team might use to actually achieve that. They may quickly reject new ideas as impractical before giving them a chance. So rather than rejecting new ideas, perhaps they would want to sit down and think about why they're rejecting them, what are the inconsistencies and flaws of these new ideas to actually make those new ideas better and give them a way to actually implement those ideas. They may fail to recognize trends or see the big picture, may not see the big picture because they're too focused on the short-term results. So it may be useful for them to start thinking about, if we carried on with our current behavior, what would things be like in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years' time, and hence what changes do we want to make in order to achieve our desired result. They may steamroller over any obstacles, and those obstacles might include people, so you need to modify their behavior in that sense, and they may not celebrate successes. And for people in this ESTJ team, because everyone has a thinking preference, that may not be so important within the team, but it may reduce the impact of the team outside. So this, again, may be something they want to think about. This perhaps is quite general, about ESTJ teams in general. Let's think about how this might apply to particular applications, to the sort of task, the sort of stuff that teams may actually have to do in practice. And one thing that pretty much every team needs to do is to solve problems, to collect and process information ideas, and then, as a team, to make a decision based on that information. And a really good way for teams, or indeed individuals, to do this is the use of what they call the zigzag model. In the United States and elsewhere, it's often called the Z or the Z model, and you might see that written down rather than the zigzag model here and there. Now, we've talked before about extroversion and introversion, about judging and perceiving in teams, but the zigzag model uses the middle two aspects of personality, sensing and intuition, and thinking and feeling. In making a decision, in solving a problem, you first of all need to take in information and then to make a decision based on that information. Sensing and intuition relate to the way we prefer to collect and use information, and thinking and feeling relate to how we prefer to make decisions. The idea behind the zigzag model is that we make sure that we use both sensing and intuition to gather the information, and then use both thinking and feeling to make the final decision. So you might, for example, start with sensing. What's real? What do we actually know? What are the facts? Perhaps, what can we learn from past experience? Then move on to intuition. Where are we heading? How does everything connect together? What's the big picture here? Then take all that information, weigh up the pros and cons, and look to see what the objectively right answer would be using thinking. And finally, think about how that decision will impact on the people involved and how this relates to your values using feeling. Now, each of us has our own preferences when it comes to sensing or intuition, thinking or feeling. My own type is INTP, introversion, intuition, thinking and perceiving. So unless I stop and force myself, I will tend to spend a lot of my time, most of my time, using intuition to think about possibilities and ideas, perhaps ignoring sensing issues like what does past experience tells us, what's realistic, and then go on to make a logical decision using thinking, ignoring feeling issues like how will this decision impact other people, who else needs to be involved, how can I get buy-in from other people, and so on. But since I've learned more about my MBTI type, this is less of an issue. For an important decision, I can force myself to spend equal amounts of time and effort on sensing, intuition, thinking, and feeling, asking myself relevant questions at each stage. And what goes for individual problem solving, of course, also goes for team problem solving. So in an ideal world, let's look at how the zigzag model might work in a team. The team might start by looking at the problem in a sensing way, looking at the facts and what past experience could bring to the picture, being realistic and building on from what's already known, but then also using intuition. Using intuition to look at possibilities in the big picture and where things are heading, and to make sure new ideas are included. Then taking all of our information and using both thinking and also feeling equally to come to a well-rounded decision. But of course, real teams don't usually have equal numbers of people with sensing, intuition, thinking, and feeling preferences. Real teams will tend to spend rather more time on their favorite processes and rather less time on things that come less naturally. So, for example, how would this work for the ESTJ team we looked at before? Well, the dominant type of the team is ESTJ. Only 2 of the 5 people have an intuition preference, and no one at all has a feeling preference. So in team meetings and in team problem solving, there will be more attention paid to the sensing side of things, and new possibilities and the big picture might get sidelined. And very little or no attention might be paid to feeling. This team might neglect to involve other people who should have been saying things, fail to involve stakeholders, ignore values or people considerations that are important to others, either inside or outside the business, and could struggle even to keep harmony within the team itself. In fact, there's a distinct possibility that the team could go straight from discussing a problem in a sensing way to making a decision using thinking, and then move on to implement this barely using intuition and not using feeling at all, leading to a unbalanced, less optimal solution to a problem, very much weighted in favour of sensing and thinking. And that's especially likely to happen when time is short, or when members of the team are stressed, and unfortunately, so often that's when some really important decisions need to be made. But the good news is that once teams know this stuff and know what their approach to decision making is, they can compensate and make sure they do use sensing and intuition and thinking and feeling. If, for example, they have an hour meeting to debate a particular issue, they can force themselves to spend 15 minutes discussing it in a sensing way, 15 minutes discussing it from the intuitive perspective, 15 minutes discussing the logical answer, and 15 minutes taking people into account, spending equal amounts of time and energy on all four areas. And this idea of the zigzag model and using a zigzag model in teams is one of the things that I find that if I'm involved in a team building exercise, I'll pretty much always do, because solving problems and making decisions is central to the functions of many teams. And in the good old-fashioned world where you didn't have to meet people virtually, you might get people in a room and write questions relating to sensing, to intuition, to thinking and feeling about each of these, about the problem at hand, and pin those on the four walls of the room and ask people to spend equal amounts of time discussing each. And one of the things you will find in a real-life team is that voices which previously weren't heard because they perhaps weren't in the majority team can actually come out and really be appreciated for the first time. And even in the virtual world, you can still do very similar things. Now, all of these ideas, all of this information about how any particular team might be affected by the zigzag model is available both for the team and also for the individual within the team once all the members have completed the MBTI assessment, either using the MBTI team report or using the MBTI online teams process. Now, as I said, I spent quite a bit of time looking at decision making, and that's because decision making and problem solving are really important. But of course, there are often other things that you might want to look at as a team, and a lot of these will also relate to personality. Communication, for example. If you were to sit in on a meeting involving our ESTJ team, one of the first things you might notice is that it could get quite loud. Over half the team have preference for extroversion. There'll be lots of discussion. People will be thinking out loud, talking over, perhaps interrupting each other. You may notice that the figure in the ESTJ graphic at the bottom right of this slide has a loudspeaker. And that's quite deliberate, given some of the behaviors, given some of the words you can see written around the blue border there. So in team meetings, it's going to be really important that the two people who prefer introversion are given a chance to speak. And that when they do speak, the other team members do let them speak. They don't jump in and interrupt them. They let them say their piece first. Now, most of the people in this team have, as part of their personality, a particular aspect of their personality called extroverted thinking. This is part of type dynamics, which goes into another level of looking at MBTI results. What that means in terms of communication is that their communication is likely to be quite direct, quite no-nonsense, very much to the point, may sometimes seem a little forceful, even perhaps especially under stress, may sometimes even seem a little bit aggressive. So when they're communicating to others inside or outside the team, it might be a really good idea just to pause for a moment, if they can, especially if they're sending emails or any other written communication, and just think a little bit about and review what they're about to say or what they're about to send. Now, the sensing preference of this team overall means that they could be quite focused on facts and details. So if the intuitive members of the team start talking about less tangible ideas or the big picture, others in the team may see this conversation as unrealistic and want to cut them off. But often it would be really useful if they can resist this impulse, because that's one way in which new ideas can be brought into the team, which will actually contribute to the team meeting its overall objectives. So you might, for example, ask those with their intuition if they can think of a better way to accomplish the team's goals or accomplish the decision that the particular meeting is being focused on. And the team will typically want to move quickly to decision and move on, and might be a little impatient, irritable even, if the perceived member of the team wants to explore new information and ideas first, even if doing so might eventually make for a better decision. The team might even take a task to ask the receiving team member if there's any more information that needs to be considered before a decision is made. And this team will typically want to move quite systematically through the agenda, checking off topics as they go. So they may want to allow the receiving person a little bit of leeway if they say, actually, there's this additional thing that just come up, which is important, because it could be a really important thing to concentrate on. So for each member of the team, with their individual personality types, there are going to be particular actions that they can take to help improve communication in a team. Here, for example, are some of the actions that the ENTP person in our ESTJ team could take. So things like stop talking occasionally and listen carefully what others have to say, remembering that their ideas will be taken more seriously and progress more if they can support their ideas with facts and data, making a conscious effort to communicate their appreciation for the contributions of others, and when they're just thinking things through, just let people know about their thinking out loud and let people know when they made a decision. People with ENTP preferences tend to make decisions inside their head and sometimes forget to tell people that they've made a decision. So some of the listeners may not be able to tell what's going on there. And there'll be different actions for each team member, for the ISTJ team members we saw earlier, for the ESTJ team member, for the ENTJ member, depending on their individual type and the overall composition of the team. And by knowing the MBTI personality type, individual team members can also see how they might cause conflict in the team, and so they'll be able to modify their behavior so as to make conflict less likely. So again, here are some possible actions for an ENTP individual in an ESTJ team. And I've just literally taken this from the team information that you can get out of the MBTI team report. You may notice that there's a lot of overlap between the actions people can take in terms of relieving conflict and the communication, because the way you communicate can contribute to or alleviate conflict. Now, in the time we've had together, we've only really been able to perhaps scratch the surface of how we could use personality to see our teams can collaborate rather than clash. Because personality really is the key to unlocking how teams behave and how to help them perform to the optimal level. So, by building people's self-awareness, by helping them to understand their own personality, that's really the first step in helping them to understand how they're similar to and different from other people, and therefore understanding other people's personality. And that in turn, in a team, means that they can both improve and understand their relationships, their one-to-one relationships with individual team members, and also have a more useful understanding of how the team operates as a whole, so that they can know the likely strengths and possible blind spots of the team, how they may go about solving problems, how they might best communicate, how they might work with conflict, all of the things that we've just talked about and talked through. So thank you very much for your time today. I know that as we've been talking, some of you have come up with a number of questions, and we'll spend some time at the end to look at that in a moment. But first, I'm going to turn you back over to Elmer, who will take you through some of the possible next steps that you might want to take, and how you can, in particular, access all of these insights that we've talked about today, all of these insights about teams, how you can access those for yourself. So, Elmer, over to you.
Thanks, John. There are some good questions in there, so looking forward to hearing your answers to those. And if you like what you've heard today and you're wondering how you can use this with your teams, I'm just going to talk you through the three main options while John's reading your questions. And I've dropped a link to our Teams page in the attachments too, so if you want to read about them, that's there in more depth. And I'd say the first, most powerful thing you can do is train in the tool yourself, as the people on here who are qualified can more than happily tell you, because the qualification not only gives you access to assess personality differences, but supports you to improve communication, reduce conflict, manage stress, and help teams across your organisations to work better. Our virtual courses run regularly, but they have been booking up quickly, so if it's something you want to do, let us know as soon as you can. We can also run in-house courses for companies who want to train 4 or more people together on a date that suits them, so options can be flexible. The second solution we have is the MBTI Insights Virtual Workshop, and this is a great way to introduce the MBTI to your team with the help of our experts. Each participant gets the group feedback led by one of our consultants so that they can find out their Myers-Briggs personality type and what it means to them. And then there are options for add-on workshops that build resilience, manage change, and enhance communication, all of which are essential at the moment. Lastly, if you're looking for a quicker, more self-directed option for your team, then I wanted to highlight MBTI Online Teams, which John's talked about a little bit today. Your team gets individual insights as well as a team report that covers all of the key information that John's reviewed today. And each team member also gets individual courses as a bonus to dive deeper into communication, stress and confidence. And everyone completes the training at their own pace. It's a great way to start your journey with the MBTI. So there's our three main options. I hope John's had some good time to look at those questions. Are there any you've picked up while I've been talking, John?
There's actually quite a few questions, so I think we've got about up to 10 minutes, so I'll just start and go through them. Do come up with any more questions as I'm talking, if any new ideas are sparked up what I've been talking through. So the first question is, does this all apply to virtual teams as well? And I think the short answer is yes, and I think the longer answer is possibly even more so. And think about some of those things we were talking about communication before. Communication is more difficult in a virtual team. You miss out on a lot of those nuances that you might see. So I think understanding the team dynamics, understanding how the team is working is even more important for virtual teams. For those of you who are already MBTI practitioners, if you haven't had the chance to already download some of our new materials, in our new MBTI playbook, which you can download, we've actually put virtual versions of a lot of the exercises you might do with teams of individuals in there already, so you can see how you might actually accomplish some of these tasks. We have another question. I think my co-worker and I are both perceiving, but we still have conflicts. Why is that? Okay. There's another linked question to that that's also come up, which I'll go through in a second. It's an interesting question because you might think that if people both have the same personality type, you are perhaps less likely to have those conflicts. And that a lot of the time is the case, but again, it's all about context. So if you think about perhaps, take an example of a partner, your husband, your wife, your partner, if you both have perceiving preference, you both like to do things when they come up and so on. But once perhaps children come along, there are certain things that have to be done in a certain time, at a certain time. And what you sometimes find in those relationships is that if both of people have a perceiving preference, and one of them is the person who always has to do the things that have to be done on time, they start to rather resent the other person. And sometimes you can see the same sort of behaviors play around at work. I think one of the things that the MBTI and type more generally gives you is a framework where you can start to talk about these issues openly without laying the blame on other people. So you can actually come to a modus operandi where you can work together. And we had another linked question which said, what do you recommend when there is a balance of P's and J's? Actually, the question said J's and P's. So is there a balance of judging and perceiving people in the group? And I think, again, what you'll see then is it's really important, first of all, for people to understand each other, understand where they're coming from, but not to use type as an excuse. So not to say, well, of course I have to have the plans organised this far in advance. What do you expect? I'm a judging person, or of course I'm not on time, I'm a perceiving person. Type is an excuse. But understanding each other, again, means that you can work out a modus operandi where you can work together to each other's mutual benefit. Okay. We have another question, which is this something we should be doing at the recruitment phase? In other words, I guess, if more diverse teams are more effective, should we be recruiting for diversity? I think there's two answers to that. The first answer is that in reality, when you're putting a team together, tend to be recruiting for skills. So we want somebody who can work this IT piece. We want somebody who is an expert in this. We want somebody who knows about that. And that often is the way that teams are put together. Issues about personality don't come into it, and you then need afterwards to think about, okay, given the personalities of the team, how can we make these people work together? The second answer is that there are some personality instruments which can be used in recruitment, but the MBTI is very emphatically not one of them. The whole ethos of the MBTI is that it's not a questionnaire, it's a process by which people complete the questionnaire, then have feedback, and then put those two pieces together to decide for themselves what personality type best fits them. And that's a process which works incredibly well when it comes to individual or team development, but is really not suited for recruitment purposes at all. Okay, we have another question. How does culture impact the model? Company culture and individual culture. I think the way that you tend to see this expressed is not in underlying personality differences, but in behavior. So, for example, and I'm going to use national cultures as an example here. If you look at the difference between Americans, generally, North Americans, people in the UK, and people in Finland, you're going from a continuum of more demonstrative in behavior through to less demonstrative in behavior. So for an English person looking at a group of Finnish people, they all appear to be acting in an introverted way. But if you talk to the Finnish people, they can clearly say, well, actually, that person is extroverted, that person is introverted. You're still getting the same differences, but they're filtered through the lens of the culture. And that's why it's really important to know the culture of the country you're working in, know the culture perhaps of the organization you're working in, although research suggests that organizational culture doesn't typically make as big a difference as national culture. A joke which was told to me by a Finn, so it's okay to repeat it, is how do you recognize the Finnish extrovert? The answer is the Finnish extrovert is the person who looks at your shoes, not their own shoes, when they're talking to you. Okay. Can we use the MBTI to resolve issues of bullying was another question. And someone else asked the question, which I think is coming from the same place of those of you who've been looking at the news in the UK recently. Did Jackie Weaver have the authority? The MBTI in and of itself isn't a cure for bullying, obviously. But one of the things we do find, and is backed up by research not just with the MBTI, but with lots of the tools, is that generally speaking, as the self-awareness of managers and leaders is raised, they are less likely to be bullies, they are more likely to be appreciated by their staff, they're just likely to be better leaders in all sorts of ways. And we know from other research that there are many useful ways in which you can increase people's self-awareness. One of the most useful are things like coaching, but actually the MBTI is a really useful way of building people's self-awareness, and we've got some research evidence that backs that up. And what we've also found, anecdotally and in research, is that self-awareness does make it more likely that people will approach other people on their terms and not in a more bullying way. Okay, we have a few more questions here and a few more minutes to go. Okay. We have a question here. I am MBTI certified and a frequent practitioner. I've conducted top team building sessions with management teams. I can use fresh ideas now and just look at team challenges and strengths. On my online trainings will focus on team building sessions. Can you recommend any written material too? Okay, so there's lots of things about how to use the MBTI there, lots of ideas for exercise for the MBTI, which you can buy. You'll also find some free exercises on our website, and again, do look at the MBTI playbook that I looked at before, that we talked about before. We're also just about to look at launching some new programs, some new virtual live programs, which can be used with groups to help them through different aspects of personality. So do ask us for some more information on the virtual live. But Elda, I don't know if you have any information on the new virtual live sessions that we can send to people, or if that's something we can pass on.
I was thinking this is quite a big question actually, and something that we, one of those perfect ones where we say we'll follow up with you about that afterwards, because I think it would be good to have a conversation about what they want to achieve, because we've got so many offerings. It's just about getting the right one. So if you feel that you're a qualified practitioner and you have the same question, then just reach out to us afterwards, because I think that's a really interesting area where we've got a few things to talk through with you about.
And we have another question, which I think is possibly coming from a similar place, which perhaps we'll get back to individually as well, which is where can I find more information on MBTI in teams as a qualified MBTI practitioner? Okay. We have another question. This may need to be our last one because we're probably getting a little bit tight on time. If I understand correctly, only the diverse in JP make the team performance worse. All of the dimensions diversity make the team perform better. I think the answer to that is not necessarily. I think, again, it's all about understanding each other. If we look at things like conflict, for example, we know that judging and perceiving is important, or rather, knowing about judging and perceiving is important in dealing with and alleviating conflict. But another key input into conflict actually is thinking and feeling. And if one person in the team or one part of the team has preferences for thinking and the others have preferences for feeling, that can very much lead to conflict. And you can see some information about conflict on how J&P and TNF work together as well on our website. It might be also useful, especially if you're not qualified already, in the MBTI, to look at the TKI, the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode instrument on our website as well, which is another tool which looks quite directly at conflict. Okay. I think we're probably just about run out of time. Aldo, is that the case? Or do we have time for one more question?
I think you've done most, and I think you've at least covered. I think they've got a couple of questions left that you've kind of covered. So yeah, I think for me, I think we'll leave it there. And if you think of any questions afterwards, then do reach out to us, and we can get back to you on those. And yeah, thank you very much, John. Thanks for your time, and thank you for everybody who joined us today. And we hope you find that useful. Like I say, do reach out to us afterwards if you do think of any questions. And thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.